Hello and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Douville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man about to celebrate the end of the year by recording his grossest podcast.
Tim Longo.
Do you get that? You know what a gross is?
Ring a bell.
A gross
is that
12 dozen?
12 dozen. Okay. Yeah.
And
I figured it was a number.
Our 144th podcast.
Nice.
So it's a gross
done.
podcast.
Right.
Yeah. Here we are.
Wow.
Yeah, so here we are. It's the end of another year.
144.
It's our third year-end episode.
That's crazy to me. I don't even remember last week. So the fact that we did 3 years is amazing to me.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying in the pre-show just like how it's fun to go and look and, we played all these games this year.
Yeah.
Which, for me, are about 90% of the games I actually played and finished this year are the games that we played for the cast.
Yeah, for sure for me. Yeah.
Because of mostly this year because of this injury and all that stuff. But I touched on some other games. I played other games a little bit, but I'm not sure it's like maybe one or two other games I actually finished, but most of the games came from this and from this discussion every week.
Well, you're able to fit them in a little bit better than I just. The podcast generally is, makes the bulk of my time and my games, so which isn't bad because we're playing great games generally. So it's not a bad way to spend the time, but
not a bad way to go. Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
I actually, I had said at the beginning of the Pokemon episodes that it might be the first game that we've played that neither one of us had played, but that wasn't true.
Yeah, I figured I couldn't
the
remember.
First game this year was Anachronox, and neither one of us had played
that.
So.
Right.
But then after that, we had Metal Gear Solid, Ultima Underworld, which I think you had played.
Yeah.
Okay. The two King's Quest.
Had you not played Ultima?
Games? I had not. No, I'd played a lot of the mainline Ultima series, but I'd never gotten around to Underworld. I had tried it once and bounced off because by the time I tried it, the interface was. I was already like, oh, this is not how a first-person game works, or whatever. So I was like, I'm not. Yeah, I'll go play. Like it was the year I don't know, Thief came out or something. I'm like, I'll go play Thief. The King's Quest and Space Quest games, God of War. Star Wars Dark Forces, Deus Ex, Tomb Raider, Thief the Dark Project, GTA 3, and of course we're playing Pokemon, but we'll count that next year, right? So
man, those are some good games.
Yeah, there are some good games. Yeah, it was really fun listening back. I listened back to the interviews. I kind of speed listened. I was playing some Shadow of the Tomb Raider actually, and speed listening to the podcast at like double speed, which is actually good, but there's a lot of pauses. Podcast players have gotten better. I use Overcast and it like clips out any spaces as well. It's
that's what I use too. Oh, how funny. I guess I never even thought of that.
There's you can like swipe left on the play screen and there's all these controls for like, smart speed or something like that, and clip out gaps, and I was like, that's kind of neat.
Our podcasts are 20 minutes long
and now they're a lot faster. Well, I did listen to I listened to them all. So that's Tom Hall of Anachronox, Mark Crow, Space Quest, Darren Stinnett. Oh yeah, that's actually Mark Crow is one I was like, I know the moment that you've got from that. Darren Stinnett, of course, for Dark Forces, as well as Matt Tadaishi. That's right, Tadaishi?
Yeah,
That's his name? Okay.
Yeah.
Jill Murray, who was a lead writer on Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Greg LaPiccolo and Randy Smith, we interviewed together for Thief, and Lulu Lumiere, also for Thief, but she was a triple threat because she had also worked on the Tomb Raider reboot and System Shock 2,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. So
and a little bit of early Deus Ex, I think, right?
Well, she was maybe, yeah. She was there, right, working on Thief, Deadly Shadow 3, whatever 3 was. Right. And so in fact she brought up Warren Spector as like, well, he was the head of the studio, but I never got to get the stuff I needed from him to learn, about production and things like that. So, it was an interesting A lot of interesting conversations this year. It was really fun to listen to them again. Of course, I had lived through them once and then listened to them again to produce them. And then today it was just like, I can actually just enjoy them. So it was fun to revisit. So,
yeah, it's a good year, man. Metal Gear, Deus Ex, Ultima, Thief, all in 1 year. Some of my favorites.
Yep. No, that was a good year. It was definitely a good year. And for me, being introduced to some of these games, so Anachronox, Ultima Underworld, the 2 Quest games, that was all amazing. I mean, those were all good games. So it was definitely fun for me too to just be exposed to these things that you kind of look at. They're like, well, maybe someday, but the further back they go, especially those Quest games, like I never would have gotten around to those ever, because they're too far back.
Yeah.
But they're totally worth playing. And of course, listening to all of this today, I was like, I really should play more of all of these games. I was like, oh my God, when would I find the time?
That's the weird thing about this podcast is it is, I mean, we even talked about it with Pokemon so far, at least for myself. It's forcing us to do things that, and I say forced, it's not a negative thing, but, just, I
wouldn't say force, it's structuring us. It's
sure.
giving us a pattern to follow.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Giving us a rhythm.
Rather than force is, it puts you in the rhythm and you make sure you make that time each week to play the game. And of course, in the last half of the year, mostly I've been doing the streaming as well. And that's been a blast because I have people there who are asking questions, not usually stuff that we'll necessarily talk about on the podcast, but just, hey, what do you think about this or that? This thing in the news, the game's news or what have you, but also giving me feedback of like, oh, you should do this in this game. Like, right. Oh yeah, that's cool. Great. And that's also helpful. So, cause sometimes there's things that I'm just like, oh, I would not have known that. I'm glad you told me.
Yeah, totally. That must be a lot of fun to do it that way. I will probably never get my act together to do that, but I'll try.
Well, if you ever do, I know all the stuff. All you need to do. Matt Allen Estock. Oh, God, I hope I didn't mispronounce that. Anyway, he had sent me email with all that detail, and I'm happy to pass it along to you. He's who's like, oh, if you're going to do a PS2, then you need to have this and this and this other thing, right? So
good for him,
as well as a capture, device. So it was really helpful, and it was like, oh, and here's some Amazon links. Just go click this and add this to your cart, et cetera. So it was perfect.
Yeah, that's great. It just seems like magic to me. So I haven't taken the plunge.
I found that in computer science, a lot of magic is really just a lot of cables. Which is why I've got boxes of cables in my basement that I don't even know what they go to anymore.
Right.
So I might need to rethink what I think of as magic. Anyway,
well, I think you built up a good rapport with the listeners by doing that too, which I think is really cool. And they may have never seen me stream, but they see some of those Twitter links are just hilarious. You playing the Jackbox with them.
That's pretty good. That's one of the fun things that we do occasionally is that at the end of a stream, I'll just throw on a Jackbox game. We'll do a round or two of something like Quiplash or Fibbage. We've even done a drawing one, although those are tricky because the timing takes even longer. Because there's a lag, right? Because I'm streaming,
right?
And that gives me an advantage in theory, but not with the art ones, I'll say. But my drawing is terrible. But it does give me a leg up with the words in theory. But Mas Neotech Proto, that guy shows up and wins, I guess, Quiplash all the time. So he's tough. Okay, let's turn to the content, as they say. I have. In listening to these, I identified some big themes that I thought came through again and again that are things that I thought I would, are things that would influence the way I think about games. They're not always themes, they're themes that I'm hearing multiple times in that sense. They're not always like necessarily a lesson, but they might be a fact about game development in a couple cases, or and especially in some of these older games, so there's a couple that are like that. And there are a couple that I think are very much like, this is a good way to think about game development at times. So that's kind of how I organize
sort of gems, if you will.
Yeah. Gems of different kinds. or even just sort of reflections on the state of the art at the time, that came up multiple times, that multiple people commented on. So that was it's just stuff that would snag in my brain. I had tons of like individual clips that I could have included, but these things started coalescing for me, and I started saying, oh yeah, that other person was talking about this sort of thing. And I just started making those connections, and I'll present those kind of that way. And when I put together the clips, I might pull in just a couple sentences from one person or another person and crossfade them. So you might be hearing that, because of course, spoilers, we don't actually listen to the clips again when we record this. I put them in afterwards, but we talk about it like, oh, what clip is this? Yeah. And I describe for Tim, oh, it was when so-and-so was saying such and such. He goes, oh yeah, I remember that. And then we talk about it afterwards. So
Brett is way more prepared than I am for the end of the year. And as I like to, let people know, Brett does pretty much all the work. So
a fair amount of work. I enjoy it.
Thank goodness for him for doing that.
Yeah, I don't live on an island, so.
Oh boy, yeah. They pipe. I'm actually cranking a generator right now to actually get the internet to work. So it's really quiet.
Riding a bike.
Riding a bike very quietly.
Power it. Yeah, all the hamsters are working. And you organize yours how? You more go by your memory, right?
Yeah, they're because basically kind of memorable moments that and I kind of obviously reviewed what we played and kind of was just thinking back, and that's what because I am less prepared than Brett is, I'm just kind of going from my already established terrible memory. But if they stood out in my memory, then they must have been good, memorable moments. And so I have a sort of multi-part, three or four multi-part ones that are sort of smaller moments that kind of add up for a few different guests. So I can go through those, and then sort of like a theme at the end that we won't really have clips for per se, but something that I kind of wanted to end on for my own set. Yeah.
Yep. I guess we can just jump right in then. You can give us your first moment.
Yeah. So as Brett maybe was predicting, having Mark Crow on was sort of like a dream come true sort of moment. Even though he seemed like a pretty humble guy and hasn't really been too active in game development lately, but he's getting back into it. But as for someone who grew up with the Sierra games and specifically Space Quest, being some of my sort of most influential, and I think I even mentioned it on the series, just the fact that when I got really into Sierra games, the concept that there were actual people making these things and there were developers out there someplace. And then because I lived in the foothills of the Sierras, finding out that Sierra itself at that time was also in the foothills of the Sierras. It wasn't near where I lived directly, but it was, a couple hours away. And they were just in some building someplace making these games that I loved, and kind of following Sierra over time. And as they, I think Space Quest got up to 6 sequels, I believe. And so following them over time and then getting bought and all that kind of stuff, and then kind of fading off into the sunset. So having one of the 2 guys from Andromeda on, really big moment for me on the podcast. And we've had so many good guests. Every guest has been crazy, but that one in particular was just a treat. And so a couple sort of multi-part small moments that added up for me. One, I recall him, we kind of asked him about the early days of Sierra, and the clip that I remember was just kind of him. It's a funny clip for me as a memorable moment because I feel like he was fairly nonchalantly just talking about the office and how it felt to him, and complete with like pencils in the ceilings and stuff like that, and it just was blowing my mind because I had this fantasy about what it was like to work at Sierra, and it was, it was just like any other office in a way, right? In Oakhurst, California, and and just the early days of that, yeah. So that description when he was kind of just talking about those first days of them sitting in the office and the 2 guys basically brainstorming, and they kind of gave him. I remember him saying they kind of gave him essentially they gave them sort of carte blanche to hey, what do you guys want to do? And they pitched Space Quest originally. And so that description of the office is a weird one for me, but I think it's interesting to think about how far game development has come, especially for one of the older developers, at least in the West, so that was my first memory.
Yeah, it's a good one. And here's the clip.
The company had just moved into this big, brand new, they call it the Redwood building. They're in Oakhurst, which is now it's a medical facility, but it was the biggest commercial building in Oakhurst. And we just moved in it and had just, prior to moving in it, had a massive layoff. And so the hallways were empty. It was like a ghost town. And that's about the time we were wrapping up Black Cauldron. And when Ken gave us the green light to get working on the game, he basically gave us pick of our offices, our office, I should say. And there was a whole section of the building, upper floor, with vacant offices, and that's where we holed up. And basically spent our days shooting pencils at the ceiling, sticking pencils in the acoustic tiles in the ceiling, and brainstorming ideas, and just throwing ideas, and whatever stuck, we would develop that, and just brainstorming, using each other as a soundboard for ideas, and running with what sounded funny to us. And I'm sitting there at the computer, and I was able to whip up graphics as we thought of them.
Wow.
And throw together prototype scenes and do animations or whatever. So it was just kind of a magical time as far as that goes, as far as being able to do whatever we want, have carte blanche over what we wanted to create.
Yeah, that's a funny moment, because I can hear in real time your brain exploding.
I don't know what I had in my head, it's just because it was romanticized, right? And now we've been in the industry so long, it's no longer romanticized.
No, it's very much not romanticized.
Yeah, so it's just it was a funny moment, because I just had this version of Sierra in my head. The two other small ones that kind of are sort of a set for me with Mark, because it was such a treat to have him on, were also sort of jaw-dropping moments for me. One, which I think I commented in real time on, was him finding the original photo plate. I think it was a slide or something, right?
Right, he had a slide negative, yes.
A slide negative of the picture on the back of the box of the two of them with their ridiculous alien head things, noses on, and they're pointing up at Half Dome. And which is obviously in the logo, Sierra, and that picture is just it's just burnt into my brain as a gamer, and he just found it at the bottom of some box or something. I forget what he said. It was in his car or something.
No, it was in a box. Yeah,
was it? Yeah, and then the partner to that was his quick description about the origin of Roger Wilco. And he mentioned actually a piece of art that Brett found the link to, I believe, afterwards, and sent it to me. And it's just it's those little funny anecdotes we get sometimes on the podcast, and the guests often think they don't think anything of it. They just sort of throw it out there. And Roger Wilco, again, is another one of those characters for me that will always be, in my gamer heart, and to know kind of its original origin was cool. So here are the two clips for that.
So we just drove up there and snapped a couple of pictures, and it's funny because I was just digging through some old files of mine, and I dug up. I have the original 35 millimeter slide that was taken of us up there.
Are you
kind of mind-blowing to come across that.
Oh my God, that's a relic. That's a video game relic. You gotta keep it forever. That's great. Donate it to the Smithsonian. I don't know. I'm just giddy right now that I didn't even anticipate talking about that picture, but I think I'm just giddy that you're describing the process of it.
Are you familiar with the artist Clibben? I think is his name.
I don't think I am.
Clibben. He has these really bizarre art books that he come out with as sketchbooks. Mm-hmm. And they were just so thought-provoking, and we always had those. Scott had those laying around, and I was looking at those, and there was one drawing in there of this geeky-looking guy. It's just this. I wish I could throw it up on the screen and You could see it. But I looked at that and I just laughed. Isn't it? All it said on it was Roger Wilco was his character's name. I thought, that's it. That's our character, Roger Wilco.
Nice.
And
so those are awesome little moments that keep me going in my insanity as a game developer. So what's your first theme / memory?
Right. So I have these are a bunch of little clips where because like I said, I had a number of things that I just noticed coming up again and again, which I hadn't really done in the past. I hadn't noticed that happening. And this year I have a number of these. But because you mentioned Roger Wilco in particular, I figured I'd start with that one. So it was Mark Crow talking about how they started with the character first. And that for me was a real theme that came through a lot this year. And I'm just also going to tack on growing character as part of that. But basically what the character's journey is can inform a lot of what you're doing, especially in story-based games, right? So the other 3 clips, and none of them are super long. Tom Hall talking about Anachronox and how he just, with each of these characters, would work back to like, what is their problem? Because Anachronox meant this poison from the past. And so basically all the characters in that game have some problem that's haunting them. And that's what the game's about, resolving those problems that are haunting them. And of course, it's also the overall universe's problem, right? So, and he talks about how each character does that. Then Darren Stinnett talks about how, well, we couldn't use the characters from the films.
Right. Yeah, I remember that.
Because those are George's characters and those are George's stories to tell. And we needed to go and find our own story to tell. And that's how Justin Chin came up with Kyle Katarn. And then the last one is growing a character. In the case of Jill Murray with Lara Croft in Tomb Raider. So that's the 4 you're about to hear.
And when did he become a janitor? Was it shortly after, or was he always a janitor?
I think he was always a janitor. Okay. We always kind of saw him as this underdog type character, and we thought, well, wouldn't it be funny if he was just he's this custodian on this ship, and that's kind of his genesis. Is he's this reluctant hero, and all he knows is mopping floors and taking cat naps in the janitor's closet.
I think the characters came first. Mm-hmm. So it was basically having to tell their stories, like, how do you have a universe with a sort of brilliant space scientist and a planet and a robot and a down to this luck detective and a superhero, how does that fit? Yeah. And then some of those became like civilizations or stuff, like you have to have Krypton to have the superheroes, and you have to have a planet of scientists to sort of frame Ro and so on. So again, a lot of them would have been like sort of home worlds to some, or destination worlds, like, seeking out the ancient knowledge at Hephaestus or something that always seems to be secreted away, like the Citadel in Game of Thrones or something. So a lot of them just came from that, and some of them we didn't get to, but that's why you have the sort of disparate nature of destinations, and some of them came just from the story. It's like, well, now they have to find out this thing, and where would that be, and so on.
Interesting order of operations that the characters are coming first. I mean, it's actually cool to hear that, and it makes a lot of sense in retrospect. And it gives them more, I guess I'd say, more kind of meaning and purpose as you find them, and add them to your party.
Narrative path, right? Yeah, they're just. I mean, having sort of character first stories, they have to tell their story, and that's sort of dictated, the stuff like you're not expecting comes out of your characters, and just like, I know the overall story, but they kind of like made their way across the galaxy.
Yeah.
You know what?
Yeah.
Of course, if you're walking around an hangar bay in Star Wars, you're walking around as Luke Skywalker. That was sort of a given, right? That somehow this game was going to be about Luke Skywalker and his experiences. But as it progressed, we ran into two very big problems with Luke Skywalker. One was that Luke Skywalker's story, we had to use the story that was given to us. We couldn't go build story for Luke Skywalker because that was George's job, right? He was making more movies and things like that about Luke Skywalker, and so or might someday. So he really owned that character. We couldn't just go write story for Luke. And the stories that fit for well for movies and the different action sequences and things that work in movies just don't work that great for games. So that was one big limitation. It was hard to imagine how you would make a game that could capture all the story of the Star Wars films, right, in first person and make that enjoyable and fun or even doable. Even Han Solo was off limits for the same reasons.
Sure.
We weren't in control of his story.
Yeah.
And so we needed a character that we could be in total control of and make a story for that would fit what we wanted to do with the game and not the other way around. So that's where Kyle Katarn came from.
We kind of had a little bit more leeway to do some not entirely new, not entirely different things, but I think we could be a little bit freer with the character, and also the fact that she's reaching the end of her journey, and she's learned and changed so much. We had the freedom to show that, and so the impression I have is that we just had more freedom to explore more kinds of emotional territory with her. She was afforded maybe a bit more. This is I don't like using this word in connection with Lara Croft because people sometimes misinterpret it to mean weakness, but emotional vulnerability, which does not mean that she's fragile. It means that she's able to take more risks. So vulnerability in the sense of strength.
Yeah.
But things like exploring this friendship with Jonah in particular was really great. One of my favorite things in the whole game is this incredibly awkward scene where you meet this character named Abby, and Abby and Jonah are kind of hitting it off, and Lara, being a good friend, wants to make room for that, but all three of these people are usually, just like working really hard, not necessarily having a lot of time to socialize. Lara in particular is much more of an introvert, so you just have these like three people kind of like trying to get to know each other but not really knowing how, and it's just this incredibly awkward scene.
It's a great scene.
And when
nice
and it really, honestly, that it terrified me because it was written to be awkward. Even like the first time we read it, like the guys just looked at me and were like what is this? Like the jokes are so stupid. And I think something like that in retrospect, something like that is hard enough to pull off in like film or TV, but in games, totally. I was really asking for a lot because it's like all these people have to understand the awkward and somehow get it across through animation and through these game characters, which for all of the naturalism that we've achieved, they're still not quite, like, game characters still don't have the full flexibility of just like an actor in a film. So I think that's really, really difficult to achieve, and I just can't thank the team enough for toughing it out and making it work. And I'm not sure what the turning point is, but at some point people decided like, oh, okay, no, yeah, it's awkward, and we're gonna keep it awkward.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, that's a step forward, really.
Yeah.
To be able to get to a point where that's okay. So yeah, that's all. That's 4 people talking about sort of similar issues across.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's a thing that just kept happening for me, is just noticing these connections. Some a little bit fewer people talking about it. But yeah, that was my first big theme. I knew your first moments were going to include those 2 guys from Indra.
Yeah,
I knew that picture. Listening back to it again today, and yeah, I definitely heard that coming.
In retrospect, I wonder if because I think that we've talked about this probably throughout each of those series, but I think the industry in general was struggling and growing with what character means in video games in general, around these times. So maybe it's, kind of in hindsight, 2020, maybe there's a good reason that you saw that theme, because we were trying to figure out what or they were trying to figure out what characters meant in this medium, and a lot of new creators were coming into development, right?
And supporting different goals. So Tom Hall's taking it as a very these are my themes of my game, and Mark Crow is like, how do we generate a character that's going to generate some humor? And he's that janitor who's waking up when the ship is being taken over. Darren is looking for that hero, that Star Wars hero. And with Jill Murray, she's finding that awkward moment and growing a character in a way that we actually don't see very often. So that's kind of a modern example of the sort of challenges we have now. We talked a lot about that. Not all of that's going to be in the clip, but we talked a lot about that. And so if people want to go back and find that again, I'll have timestamps and things. I think if I have time, I will have timestamps for all of this stuff. What's your second big moment or collection of little moments?
Yeah, my second one, it's kind of a big clip or medium-sized clip with a smaller one. I don't remember if they're back-to-back, but I think they're close together. And it's Matt Tadaishi talking about his development of the boss, the ending of Gromos Mines, and the boss introduction of one of the most terrifying bosses of all time in my head, at least, which I will never forget. I had forgotten that he had been the level designer on that level until we started, until I started talking to him about coming on and stuff. And so it was just fortuitous that he could talk so intelligently about that. But he was describing sort of like the reveal and the layout of the level, and I think he even hit a little bit of sort of the AI or the limited amount of how the Dark Trooper, Phase 1 Dark Trooper was kind of chasing you and stuff. But just, and then the partner to that, that basically happens later or after that is his, his creation of screen shake, camera shake.
Yep.
Back before camera shake was an actual sub feature, and how he actually simulated that by just trickery, and he talked, for anyone who's really interested in the genesis of level design, that whole interview is a great one to go back and listen to if you haven't, because he talks a lot about what it meant to be a level designer back in the day before we knew what they were, and how many tricks and hoops they jumped through. And the camera shake simulation that he did, and how he created that rumble after you place the detonators and stuff after that boss battle were 2 sort of partner memorable moments for me. So yeah, that was a good one.
The first level I worked on was the Gromos Mines one, the red level.
Oh
yeah. And that was definitely one where I was thinking like, well, this is the first thing I'm going to work on. And like Inger had kind of sketched out kind of idea, like basic blocking, but I thought, well, I better take this and because I totally forgotten this until now. Like I was hired on contract, now that I think about it.
Oh,
and then so I was like, oh man, I got to do really good because this is an awesome job. And and it was really gratifying to hear you guys talk about that boss, fight at the end, because that's definitely something people tell me about, like, oh yeah, I did that part, and they're like, oh, I still remember that.
Yeah.
Because I think the original idea was he was originally just supposed to come out of a door or something, but I was thinking like, well, that's not a very exciting introduction. And then you start thinking about all these ideas, which are just very basic problems, which every level designer has to think about. Like, well, how do I know where the player is standing when he comes out? And then I thought, well, I'm going to put it right in front of you when you plant that last bomb. And then I had him like coming out of a door and all these things that didn't matter. And I finally ended up with like this thing, like he rises out of the ground. And then that seemed to go pretty well. And then that was one of those early revelations you have as a level designer where you think like, well, you know, level design is actually, it's all these different things. But one of the big things about it is just like creating these big moments. And a lot of that is just how the moment is revealed. And specifically in this one, how this boss is revealed. You know, like you plant the charge and then there's this delay and then the lights start flashing. And I think I did this thing with the floor where I moved it up and down really fast. So it seemed like the level was shaking.
Wow.
And then he comes up and then like, you know, the lights are fire. And then like, oh, okay, that's pretty cool. And then, yeah, so that's one of those instances where all those things like kind of converge together and it all worked out.
You basically simulated screen shake by moving the floor up and down very quickly. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that is what I was doing. Yeah.
So there you have it. The early description of one of the most terrifying moments in video games for me, and I think for Brett as well.
Oh yeah, I think I'm gonna have in that clip. It'll be me saying top 5 for me of all time.
Right. I think you do. I remember you saying that. Yeah. So what about your second theme?
My second big theme is creating real places in your mind, which is, I think, exactly how Lulu Lemire described it towards the end of her interview. And I'll probably put that clip first just for that reason. But the reason why I paired this one is it's also what Darren and Matt talked a lot about, talking about Dark Forces, these very realistic, even though they're fictional places, but these very realistic Star Wars spaces, and motivating those spaces and making them, and even if you didn't know why they felt like real places, the fact that they used architects and all of that helped make that be the thing. So yeah, there are a few kind of disjointed clips here for that. None of them are super long, but you'll hear that theme coming through from these three fine folks. Granted, 2 talking about the same game, but Lulu actually talking about Tomb Raider and how the original Tomb Raider created these real places in your mind.
Sense of place, yeah. I think we talk about sense of place a lot this year, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So here are those.
How much I loved Tomb Raider at the time has really become more evident as I've gone forward, and especially working on Anniversary. Because I love the way that games create these spaces, these real places in your mind where you've been, where you've explored. And, you know, when we were working on Anniversary, if we managed to evoke that place feeling that I had from 10 years before, then I knew we nailed it.
Yeah, they brought a sense of place and a physicality to it. I mean, when we would build spaces, they wouldn't just simply, you know, make a big giant room without thinking, well, how does this room hold itself up? You know, what's the support structures? And there's subtle things that were important to them as architects, right? But to the user, I think while I doubt anybody noticed that there was thought put into how this would have, you know, because in the computer, anything holds itself up. You don't need engineering, you know, in the traditional sense to figure out how a room is going to support itself or a building. But the fact that those cues were there, I think, really, you know, drove that sense of this is a real place, and that ultimately that suspension of disbelief.
One of the big innovations in the engine at the time, which I don't think Darren mentioned, was Ray put in this thing where you could have one opening above another opening, which sounds kind of ridiculous if you're listening. But like, you know, Doom couldn't do that, and Wolfenstein couldn't do that. So we could have like a first floor that you were standing on, and then you could look above it, like into like the second floor.
Yeah. And
things like that. But we really did try to think about like, and this is just kind of standard practice for level design. Like, well, what is this room really used for? What are they doing here? And like, do they need elevators over here, or would they be over here? And, you know, like, well, the officers would be down here because this is where they're looking at the Death Star hologram. But the stormtroopers would be outside because they're patrolling, you know, things like that.
Right.
So I think the architecture bit was really just like a sense of realism that we wanted to impart to the spaces and the levels.
Yeah, so that was just that was one of my smaller themes, but it did come up a few times. Yeah, and it was one of those things that Lulu said that just fascinated me. One of many things that Lulu said that fascinated me. So terrific moment from her. Again, that might be my favorite interview of all the interviews we've done. Because there was a lot there that just really grabbed me. So anyway, what's your third big moment? Yeah,
speaking of Lulu, this is my sort of third medium/main, sort of memorable moment. And then I have a couple smaller ones, but I think for Lulu, her quote that was wrapped around her description of production about how producers are doulas, and what being a doula. Even I think she mentioned that in her interview at Crystal Dynamics, that she mentioned being a doula, and they asked her, what does being a doula have to do with being a game development producer, and she, whether it's hindsight or whatever, she nailed it, by comparing the two. And the reason that's sort of the memorable quote moment, but before and after that particular quote, she does the best job I've heard of in a long time of anyone really talking about what a producer really is and should be for the team. And unfortunately, I never got to work directly with Lulu as a producer. We were on different projects, but I regret not being able to do that, because she seems like, she was really good at it. And I know from colleagues that she was, and it was just great to have her, because we actually haven't talked to a lot of producers, maybe technically one other, I guess, with Greg, but but we haven't had a lot of producers on the podcast, and so it is an unsung role on any project, and good ones from not so good ones when you see them, and they really stand out. And I just loved her description of it, and that particular quote of what a doula has in common with a game producer.
Yeah, here's that quote.
It's not work. It felt like there wasn't anything that I could do, which can be really frustrating, and makes a lot of producers bad producers, because they feel like they have to do something. So they interfere too much or whatever. But I knew that I shouldn't do that, but I didn't know what I should do instead. But that frustration of not having anything to do and not having really any direct control or agency or whatever was challenging for me. And so I quit to be a midwife.
Well,
all right.
Yeah, I left. Yeah, I just wanted to do something real for a while. And obviously, like, when I look back, it's like I had no idea what I was doing. I was totally failing. I didn't really have the mentorship needed to get out of there, out of that hole that I'd built for myself. And so I just launched into space.
Something totally different. Yeah.
And to something completely different. I worked with a friend to produce a short film, which was fun to do production in a totally different way. And I helped deliver a whole bunch of babies.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in the process, I came back into games because Doug Church had gone to Crystal Dynamics, and I ran into him at GDC, and he was like, we really need a line producer to get this project in order and really get shit moving. And I was like, oh, that's cool. So I started interviewing, and they were like, what in the world does midwifery have to do with video game production? And I was like, actually, I think I'm a much better producer now, because this skill of creating an environment where somebody can do hard work is exactly what midwifery is, right? You don't deliver the baby. The mom delivers the baby. You're just helping in this really particular way, right? You don't have a whole lot of specific agency. You have influence. So influencing without authority, right? is kind of the whole skill. And having seen people do that really well, delivering babies, I kind of got it a lot more, and started working at Crystal and was like, oh, I used to be terrible at my job. I get it now.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about that interview with Lulu is there's also like her journey as a producer and not being good at it. And she talks about the sort of the abstraction of being a producer and how you don't have a thing that you do as a producer, and how that's really weird, of course, because we're all creators and we're all creating these things as contributors to games. And then the producer is there to push stuff out of the way so that people can focus on that. And so I encourage people to go back and listen to that, because there's several points in her, just sort of in her interview, where she talks about that stuff, about how, well, I was having this problem. I didn't know what to do with myself. Right. And then ultimately getting to the point of knowing what she should be doing, because she went and became a midwife, which is how we got there. And that was just, what a journey that interview was.
Yeah. It was. And I think you're right. It's one of our best. And she was just very, open, and very honest about her journey. And that was also great too, to have some of that humble in there. So
yeah, well, and I think that actually somewhat ties in with my next theme, which came up a few times, and that's empathy with the player. I picked this one out because it came up when we talked to Lulu. It actually also came up, and I didn't actually make a note of this, when we talked to Greg Lopiccolo and Randy Smith. Because we talked a little bit about how you start to lose your ability to be empathetic with the player because you're so good at your game and things like that. But also it came up in other places. Jill Murray talked about aftercare for your player after you've taken them to these heights of the sort of extreme emotions that we do. You had pointed out fear and aggression and being, trying to vanquish people. And she said, yeah, we don't really take care of people after we've taken them to that point.
Yeah, that was an excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Mark Crow pointed out, when you're making an adventure game, especially in a parser, you need to figure out what people are going to type. And
that's right.
That means putting yourself in player shoes. So you're going to hear a bunch of those right now. You're also the player advocate. So you have to have sort of psychology and sort of player brain and sort of a design brain as well. It feels like QA should be harder to hire for, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because there are people who are really good at it, and it's very easy to be bad at it. And, at the player advocate part, I was so, I loved what we were doing. I loved the game. I loved the atmosphere and the clubbiness of Looking Glass. And I was completely sold on the design philosophy, and even the development philosophy, sort of this data-driven approach. I thought all of that was so cool. I don't know. I was fully in. And so when we had real users come in and play, I was the first to be like, no, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
Yeah, that was like, I mean, everybody has a story about the first time they watched people play their game and they were like, oh my God, no.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad that happened so early in my career, because I don't think I handled it very well.
When it came down to it, though, and this is, I think, one of the reasons my levels are hard, and which is why it required growth for me as a designer, is like a lot of it was just watching people playtest and playtesting myself. And, I think the trick to a lot of these games, and in a lot of ways, the fundamental trick of game design in general, is that it doesn't make sense to a new player the same way it makes sense to you. Like, where Escape is a great version, like that level's very hard, and it's because I knew which path to go down, and so as a game designer, if you want to be talented, you also have to imagine being a player who doesn't have your information, doesn't speak the same language that you do, didn't build the level, can't see the map in their heads, doesn't know what's expected of them, doesn't know what's going to come around the next corner, which in Thief is a huge problem. You could be in a totally safe stretch of hallway, just like proceed one tiny little step at a time for no good reason, because you don't know that there's no guards that patrol in this hallway. And so you just have to have that very broad awareness that like lots of different people come into this problem and they all see it differently, and you're trying to communicate with them secretly to let them know, give them suggestions about what they might do, what options are available, and how to proceed. And so that's a great, like if you're a very senior designer and you just iterate through your own level, you can probably do a pretty good job with this. But as a junior designer, and also probably without enough iteration, I think that's kind of how a lot of my levels wound up hard, is you just kind of had to know what I was thinking to do to beat them as easily as I beat them.
I think sometimes when there have been discussions around empathy in games, but they've been like, how do we use games to create empathy in the player? But I think actually empathy begins with your responsibility as a game maker to the player.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for the most part, do that quite naturally. We're always thinking about like, well, what is the player doing here? Is this going to challenge them? Like, what is the rhythm of this level?
Mm-hmm.
We do that pretty instinctively without noticing it.
Yeah.
I think like that's the interesting place to talk about empathy in games, and it starts with the contract between the developer and the player.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
and I'd love to see kind of like more discussion of that going forward.
Yeah, and I think just our history in the medium has been so focused on only a few different emotions anyway, so that empathy is very directly connected to things like fear or aggression or or vanquish or conquering, and that's why I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and our aftercare for players having provoked anger and fear and anxiety in them has it's not been as good as it
No, that's a good point. Yeah.
We take people, put them in this state, feel satisfied that we've elicited something, and go, we created emotions, and then move on to the next game. And I think maybe like the role of community management starts to see, like not on purpose, it comes out of just a need to run a company, but I think community managers themselves tend to be quite empathetic, and I think maybe what we can start to see is taking more care of the whole player.
I think it was just our desire to be in the player's head. It's like, okay, what this guy's experiencing this for the first time, he wouldn't know what it is, and so it would seem odd that he would say, "Oh, that's a whatever," or he'd be pondering, "Well, what is this?" or "How do I use it?" or so it's kind of tricky how to provide clues without outright saying this is that's a whatever,
for that.
It was. I do recall how much more labor intensive it was to do a parser based game, for sure. Trying to think of every possible way somebody could be trying to type in something and what the proper response should be to guide them towards the solution.
And speaking of Jill Murray, I understand your last moment, and I knew this would be one for you, and so I flagged where it showed up as I was listening today. I was just taking notes, like, oh, I know he's gonna mention this one. But go ahead and give me that
off air.
Give me what I need.
Exactly. Off air, I needed to ask Brett the context, but I wrote down a note about Jill mentioning Gatorade, and Brett did a better job at setting up. But I mean, Jill talks about how writing for games is like Gatorade. It requires context, and it needs to be put in with that context for it to really shine and make sense and stuff. And it's not about just individual lines on the page by themselves. And I think the best game writers understand that it is a merger of those things, and they can't be taken out of context, or they shouldn't be. Just like Gatorade, you drink Gatorade in specific moments, and as we were joking about off air, you don't drink Gatorade with dinner usually. So I think it was just it kind of, I don't know if she had used it before. I don't remember if she admitted that or not. But
it was her first time talking through it. It was it wasn't off the cuff. I think she had been thinking about it, but she had never articulated it. So but it was an idea she had been thinking about. So
awesome and hilarious and aha moment. So here's the clip for that.
We have a lot still to learn internally about how game story works and what its function is and what makes it good. And personally, I think that game writing in particular is it's like Gatorade. Like Gatorade is a beverage that is only supposed to taste right while you are doing exercise, right? It has a purpose, which is to restore your electrolytes and keep you from dying while you're playing soccer or football or whatever it is that you're doing. And I think similarly, game writing shouldn't make sense while you're not playing the game.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like you shouldn't be able to look at it and go, that's great writing. It should only make sense while you are trying to like scale a cliff and get that collectible and level up your character and feel a sense of personal accomplishment.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in Jill's interview. The other thing I was thinking about, she talked a lot, and she has this theater background, as you do, and and we had asked her about performance capture, and she talked first of all about just the craziness of getting what's her name, Camilla Luddington, because she's on Grey's Anatomy, and getting her there, and everything has to be super organized and ready to go, and how much time they spend just getting everything ready so that when they do the really expensive thing, it goes smoothly. And there's a lot of great stuff around that as well about, you do this performance capture. And of course we think of film as being, you do this one shot, but in performance capture, you basically get to do the cinematography last, because you have all the data from every possible angle on these characters. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there that, like you said, is sort of an aha moment of like, oh yeah, of course, that's what that's like. Like, of course you can do that. But I never thought about it that way before, because I'm always thinking, because often that's for cutscenes, you're thinking, well, that's like film, but that it's not like film the way we do it.
No, right.
So,
yeah, it's become not like it. Yeah, it's just a total.
It's its own thing. It's its total thing. So,
yeah.
And that actually ties in a little bit with mine. I don't have a quote from Jill about it, but my last one was not knowing what you can't do, or pushing the envelope, or taking on more risk. There was just this sense of in these early days, just pushing, and because you didn't know what was out there in the great field of game design that's just getting going for computers. I came up with Mark Crow talking about what would players be able to think of and do, and like layering more, getting more use out of the screens and things like that. There was both Darren and Matt Tadaishi talking about not knowing that you don't get architecture students, right, to build your environments or whatever. But more than that, just trying to do something really bold is something that, so Darren talks about as well, of just like diving in and trying to do something kind of amazing. I'm going to try to find the quote I was thinking for Greg Piccolo. They talked a lot, both him and Randy. So it's actually both of them talking back and forth about when you're sort of a junior developer, because Randy was on this game, not really knowing what you can't do, and having this arc in your career of, I don't know what I can do, so I can do anything, to going to a point where you're a little more cautious, to going to a point where you like say no a lot. And Randy is pointing out, and Greg's agreeing, and they kind of go back and forth on this a little bit. Randy's saying, Greg's saying, well, nobody ever got fired for saying no. And Randy's saying, yeah, but you got to carry the torch forward. You have to be willing to push and do something new. And you have to know how to balance the skepticism. Here's that melange of quotes.
We were always, good. The programmers were probably cursing us, but the engineers. But we were always trying to push the technology as far as we could. Again, to try to get more of a cinematic feel wherever possible. Like, I think we were the first ones to we pushed for scrolling screens, side-scrolling screens. And the
difficult to do at the time. So that's a real innovation.
Doggone, those guys, the engineers that were working on our system figured out how to do it, and I was just overjoyed when that happened. And it was just a lot of little things like that, technology jumps that I think we helped to help push. I wouldn't say we were solely responsible for them, but I think we had the development or the engineer team on our side as far as wanting to keep pushing the technology and innovating wherever we could.
I think that the lessons that I learned, lesson I learned personally was diving in, having no idea how you're going to do what you want to do, but just diving in with passion to do it, and have a vision. I think having that vision of standing on that, standing in the control room of a deck of a Star Destroyer, that to me was just super important, having that visual. So that was key. And the fact that it worked out was was really good, right? And then some other things that come to mind are, it's really fun to work on problems that no one's solved before.
Yeah. I mean, that definitely was part of the culture at LucasArts at the time in the level design department of we're and Darren touched on this. We're doing these really hard things. So if you want to do something on your own, especially on a small team like that, you can't go to a programmer and say well, can we shake the screen? Can you write me something that will shake the screen somehow? It's you have to figure out how to do it yourself or to fake it yourself or it's not going to happen.
I mean, I think one of the ones that I've learned both from Thief, but also through the years, is that when you're working on an innovative thing, people are just going to constantly be telling you it's not going to work. Mm. And I think you need to listen to those people and figure out what they're skeptical about and figure out what you can do to address it, but they will never be happy enough. There's as a group of people, there's always going to be a handful of them who will just never come around and never believe. And you cannot let this derail you. If you believe in the thing and you think it could come together someday, you have to keep on despite the fact that there will always be people who are pretty actively trying to push it down. Because they think that's the best thing to do. I'm not trying to criticize them. I think skeptics are important for this kind of innovation. But you have to make that balance where you figure out how to listen to them, but also how not to listen to them.
Yeah, to kind of follow up on that, I think that there's kind of this growth trajectory for for at least some developers where your first stage is the stage of hey, we can do anything. Look, this engine can do anything. And then you kind of you get slapped down hard as you realize how little you really can do. And then there's the phase of I'm going to be responsible and say no to everything and shoot down everything because, you're never going to get fired by being, cautious or conservative, or whatever, that poking holes in things. Because it is hard. It's so hard to make games. It's ridiculous. And then, and so generally the kind of people that I've had the most fun working with are the people that get out of that stage and have this balance of no, it's going to be hard, but we're going to do it, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, listening to those two talk about that subject is just, it was great to have both of them on at the same time. I'm happy we got them on together.
Yeah, we had lots of back and forth. Yeah, they just went back and forth together. They obviously have known each other for a long time.
Yeah.
They all came from Vermont.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That was hilarious.
Yeah, Lulu as well. And then Nate. What was that guy's name? Was it Nate Wells? Nate Wells, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's four people all from the same place. And and I don't know if Nate Wells. Now I'm no, I feel like it was another. I'll have to go back and look. But yeah,
I thought
no, it was Nate Wells. It was Nate Wells.
I think it was.
It was Nate Wells. It was Nate Wells.
Somebody's correcting us.
She was saying Nate. She was talking about another Nate. And
Nate Schomburg was a different.
Yeah, and then right. Yeah, I'm recalling that now. But she's like, no, but Nate Wells came from the same town that Randy and I did, or whatever. And I was like, what? What are they feeding you people up there? Good Vermont.
I don't know if I ever mentioned this to you, but Randy actually, when I reached out to him for the podcast, he actually didn't want to come on unless we could get Greg on as well. Because he felt like it was important for Greg to be on, because he didn't want to represent being a junior designer on the game. He didn't want to be representing the game without Greg. So I thought that was a good move on his part to
it was a good
partner
pairing.
up on it.
Yeah. We had a similar thing with Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman.
Yeah, Dave Grossman.
A couple years back. So and it was good to have both of them. I mean, it is great. And the more people we can have in the room, as long as we can get everything in, is terrific. Because it was good to have Leonard and Tim on when we talked about Fallout.
Yeah, whose new game is announced finally.
That's right. Yeah.
Outer Worlds.
Wilds?
It is Outer Worlds.
Okay. No, because there's an indie game called Outer Wilds, so now I'm just
Outer Wilds, Outer Lands, Outer Worlds. Yeah, but I've ingrained it in my head because they're all mixed up. So
what a melange of outer places.
Oh no, don't. Stop it.
All right, we'll move on from that. Let's have your final thing.
Yeah, my final one is really there's not really a pull quote for it, I don't think, but it's more of a shout out and kind of close out, and it's really for the listeners and the folks who've written in for email, especially in the GTA series. It was a weird, harder journey for me than I realized it was going to be, and it was interesting, and I appreciate everyone who wrote in to both question, challenge, and rebuttal, question each other, allow us to push back on them. It felt like a pretty healthy discourse over a pretty complicated game, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And it was really hard for Brett and I to play that game in general for various reasons that we talked about. And I just wanted to kind of shout out to the listeners and anyone who had sort of the courage to write in for various reasons and both defend things as well as support things on both sides of the camp. And I just think it's a good thing to have a healthy discourse with the listeners on that stuff. And I'm, it's kind of brave to write in, and I'm sure a lot of people are nervous about it, and even having some replies, which was great. And so I kind of wanted to just call that out. There's really no clips that we should replay there, I don't think, but I thought as an end of the year cap, it was important to kind of call that out.
It's a thing that we actually spend a fair amount of time on each week is feedback. Most weeks, not every week, but most weeks.
Yeah, that's true.
So it is really important to us. It's a really important part of the cast for me. I'd love to hear what I love, even if it's just a story, right, of this thing that that happened. Because sometimes it's just that, but it might kick something off for us, or even just tells something about the way people play games. Like I was playing this with my brother or with my dad or with, whatever. And you get that sense of, oh, that's right. That's another mode of being in games. Right. And it's not always what we see today, right? YouTube or, streaming or whatever, these are all just different ways of being in games and enjoying games. And even though we're taking our own particular tack in trying to tackle them, they're not the only ways to play. And I think with GTA 3 in particular, we played a way that probably many people did not. So that kind of, I think, enlivened the discourse as well. So, but yeah, kudos to our brave emailers feedback.
Especially for a podcast that we didn't know if we'd get any listeners. Yeah. We were like, oh, this is an experiment. I don't know. We'll see what happens. So the fact that we even have people writing in with their own opinions on things is amazing to me. So
I'm going to reveal something now. I've been inflating the numbers, and I write all the emails.
Okay, I wouldn't be surprised. This is a big facade.
No.
I know.
No, mine is actually also from the listeners. And,
good.
It's another shout out to the listeners, and it's in particular a little medley of our singing reviews.
Oh no.
This is a top quality podcast. It has quickly become my favorite podcast. It is insightful, interesting, and funny. It's a friend and it's a companion. And it's the only podcast you will ever need. It never needs irony. I want my DGC. Now look at them yo-yos. That's the way you do it. You host a podcast called DGC. That ain't working. That's the way you do it. Playing games all day on your PC. When you cast, we will listen anywhere that you upload to. If you keep on making these, we will listen when you cast.
Oh my God, I'm crying right now.
Okay, so those are our moments, and of course, since we both ended on feedback from the listeners being one of our favorite things from the year.
Nice segue.
Right?
Wow.
We get that usually via devgameclub@gmail.com, and we of course we love the reviews, and especially if they parody a song and somehow play on the podcast, you will get me being an idiot in your podcast ears as much as they come in.
Definitely true.
But in a singing voice instead of my normal idiocy. So carrying a tune. Idiocy with a melody. But this time we just wanted to do this one email because it's not about any particular game. and Tim's going to read it because it also bears on this week, this holiday week that we're all having, and why we're doing our end of year podcast is that, it's just a break. We're doing a little something different this week. So go ahead, sir.
Okay, this is subject carpal tunnel syndrome tips from Greg Lynn, if that is his real name, which I don't think it is because his real name is at the bottom, which I'll read later. Hi, Brett and Tim. Just want to say, big fan of the pod, in particular your Final Fantasy IX episode and those latest Pokemon episodes. There seems to be some magic when you guys talk about JRPGs. Having someone explain to me the exact reasons why I found Pokemon or Final Fantasy amazing as a kid just seems to make for great entertainment. Perhaps this is because those types of games are so reliant on having efficient, effective systems, which appear to be your area of expertise. However, I'm writing to Brett just wondering if you had any tips for an avid gamer who has developed pretty bad carpal tunnel syndrome. I've heard you mention it on the pod before, and you sound like someone who is constantly battling this. So if you had any tips for coping, it would be much appreciated. I mainly play games on the Switch and PS4, but I dabble in PC. I haven't recently purchased wrist guard. I have recently purchased wrist guards to wear at night, and I do stretching and use a vertical mouse. Even with all of that, I'm finding myself wanting to abstain from gaming for the holiday break. This is a tough realization after slogging through a brutal year-end at work. Am I doomed to just watch Netflix like a noob this Christmas? Apologies if you're already discussed this at length on the pod. I've only listened to half or so of the DGC episodes, but if not, I think it would be great if you could speak on this topic for a bit on the pod, since this is a huge issue for gamers. I've done my due diligence and internet research. Physical therapists, YouTube channels have been helpful, but would love to hear some advice from a true gamer if possible. Keep up the good work and happy holidays, Greg Broken Hands.
That is
his real name.
That's his true name, clearly. Right. So I referred to my injury mostly as carpal tunnel because I just think of repetitive stress syndrome and carpal tunnel interchangeably. That's just a quirk of my brain. I don't actually have carpal tunnel, although my father did, and I have some from that I'll talk about. For me, rest, I will say, is the best thing. The more you can rest, the better your hands will be. My injury is actually in the tendons near my elbow and my left arm. That's where the real damage is. It's a little sore again now, so we'll see this week. I have a lot of reading to do on the break, so I may not game a ton. So I will be taking a rest. But you can also try to stagger those rests while you're playing. If you want to play, but set a timer on your phone and be like, you know what, I'm going to play for half an hour, then I'm going to take a 5-minute break. I do find that ibuprofen, when it starts to flare up, is very helpful because it's anti-inflammatory, right? And it is an inflammation of your tendons that you have. So that can be very helpful. Although, be careful, take with food, etc. And then I actually find that when I do have pain in my hands in particular, I will ice them. I'll just take some ice, put it in a big bowl, fill it up with water, and just stick my hand in there for 5 minutes. In fact, that might be a good thing to do in that 5-minute break. If you can, the longer you can keep it under there, up to say 20 minutes, the better. Though that is a long time when it's that cold. So yeah, I've done it. It's not easy. You really have to. At a certain point, you start to not feel it so much, and it's fine. But there's definitely a rough patch there where it becomes difficult. But yeah, I mean that's what I've always. Those are all the things I've always done. When it has been particularly in my hands, that in particular I find is really good for the icing. It's not been super helpful for my elbow. I do it there. I have this ice pack that is meant to be put around a wine bottle. It's to keep like a white wine cold.
Wait, what?
Take it, like you go for a picnic and you just put the
I get it now.
The Chardonnay in this thing. And so I'll just pull that up to my elbow. I put it over the sore spot, which both tells you what sort of crap I have in my house, but also gives you an idea of how big my arms are. I'm a computer programmer. I'm not, Lou Ferrigno over here. Anyway,
wow, what a reference.
Well, I had to.
It's not like Michael B. Jordan or something. It's Lou Ferrigno.
Lou Ferrigno, that's right. The original, the
old
one and only
reference.
Incredible Hulk, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, so those are the things that I do. I should have probably said this first. I'm obviously not a doctor, and if this is something that's recurrent for you, I recommend you see a doctor. You might talk to if you work in a field that might cause these symptoms. Often your HR department will have suggestions or can refer you, and the company will sometimes pay for it. So we don't know what Greg does for work, but for anybody else out there, that might be an avenue to get a professional to look at you, and somebody who looks at these sort of work related, and in this case hobby related injuries. But yeah, my father also did the icing on the hands, and that really helped him. He had pretty bad carpal. I'm a second generation programmer, so that was a thing. Yeah, that was a thing for him. But he didn't have it frequently, but it was bad when he did have it. It's the same is true for me. Well, until this year, I didn't have it too often, but there's definitely times where I'm typing a ton, and I have to take breaks. So take breaks, rest, all that stuff. If you're feeling pain, probably good to stop. Pain is your body saying, this is not cool. So,
well, the only, not knowing anything about this topic, the only thing I will say is the games will be there for you when you heal. Like we're all gamers. We all love gaming, but they'll be there. They'll
worry. Be there. They'll still run as we're demonstrating.
There's
still
always
a
time.
way to play these games, even 20 years later, or more in some cases. So they'll be there. And you know what? You're feeling like playing a game and you just can't because you're feeling that pain. Pop in the other half of the Dev Game Club episodes you haven't heard. There you go. Just go listen to those.
Nice. Yeah. Hours. 144 episodes.
140, really more. 144 numbered, but 72 you haven't even heard. So enjoy. You're welcome. All right. So thanks for writing in, Greg. We have some Pokemon related feedback for next time. We are still going to be playing until we have 7 badges by the end, but we have more time to do that. Although you probably haven't played any more, have you?
No, rest assured, I have played more.
Oh, have you? Oh, okay, good.
I've been grinding, and I'm into the next town, and so.
Okay, so you're making progress. That's good.
That's
good. Yeah, I'll be. I will have streamed this in the past when you hear this. No, I'll probably also stream it the weekend just before New Year's. So you can find me at twitch.tv/Brett Duville. You can of course find the podcast on Twitter at @DevGameClub. And you can also find Tim there at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
If you are celebrating Christmas this week, have a very Merry Christmas. If not, I hope you enjoyed the solstice, and I hope you like the time off. If you're traveling, please be careful. Have fun playing games and being with family this week. And with that, I guess for the last time this year, we'll say good night.
Good night.